Good morning again, everybody. And for those that are joining us just now, I just want to welcome you uh, to Building a Successful Private Practice. I'm Helen Marlo. I serve as the Dean of the School of Psychology here at Notre Dame de Namur University, where I've been here on the faculty for 25 years. So long, long history. And one of the reasons why I've stayed here at NDNU for so long is that there are very, very few graduate programs that are as clinically intensive in a real life way, in an applied way, as Notre Dame's are, and as Notre Dame's program is. So I really, really respect that. In my experience, I serve as both a dean and serve in higher education, but also have a very active private practice and have also for over 25 years. So I got established in the Bay Area in 1997 and have great practice as well. And what I found oftentimes in training students, the professors that are training are not actually doing the work and are not actually in the business of running a practice and the work. And that's something that most students really want to know about. So I think that's one of those things that can really help. And so I'm eager to share with you my experiences, and I'm happy for you to interrupt me or to jump in if you have questions, or please put them in the chat, and I will make sure to circle back. It'll be hard for me to be speaking and watching the chat room carefully. So if you put a question in, we'll circle back at the end of the presentation and I'll answer all your questions, okay? But I'd really love for you to get whatever you need to know out of this, and we'll cover some sort of broad ideas and then some real nuts and bolts. I also have a couple of handouts that I will provide for you, excuse me, in just a little bit. So take a sip. Okay. Excuse me. One of the things that I think people often don't realize when they go into private practice, it sounds really wonderful. I'm going to do my own thing. But you really have to know yourself. And so private practice is not for everybody. Private practice it requires a certain kind of skill set, which I will get into in just a moment. So it's really important to know is this is not a default for everybody. You might be someone that really enjoys an organization more. You might find private practice really isolating. You might find that the demand for being solely independent and for everything to fall on you to be the kind of pressure you don't want to have, for example. So you really need to know what is this really the right path for you? But this cartoon here, I don't want to be defined by who I am. So the point there is that in private practice, this may or may not be a good fit for you. If it's a great fit for you, you're going to be really happy and successful in it. If it's not a great fit, it might feel like you're climbing uphill the whole time. So good to know that. I ask you to have, I always tell people, think about it from a standpoint of consciousness and personal development. And so look at how do these kind of following areas, how do they influence you and how might they influence your clinical work, okay? These kind of things are the kind of things that can influence the way we practice, how we practice, who we are, what we've learned, and our happiness or not in private practice. In terms of a private practice personality, what I say here is private practice it's your own small business. You're a business owner. And so your integrity is your biggest advertisement. And so, I consulted with someone very early Friday morning for my practice. And the person said, I don't even know you, but I talked to a couple of colleagues and they gave me your name and they said that if you couldn't help me, that you're responsive and you will follow up and get me to the right person. Those are the kind of moments when we make choices about who we are as professionals that send a big message. And so if you have a hard time following up with messages or emails, you're going to have a harder time running your own business, and that's going to reflect or not. So there's a sense of integrity there of is this the right match for you? Again, not that one is better than or worse. It's just about fit. In private practice, being relational, being relatable, managing relationships is key. So I remember early on in my practice, there were certain referrals that, and we'll talk about this later, that you might be tempted to take because you're hungry to have patients. Um, I didn't do that. But what I would do is always follow up with the person and say, hey, that's not a really good match for me, but here's someone else that might be a good match. And so those kinds of things would cultivate a relationship. And more often than not, people would come back to me later and say, you know, I knew that you didn't have space for me, or I wasn't the right kind of referral for you, but you still followed up with me and you gave me these great suggestions or these great resources. It comes back. And so those whole idea of relationships mattering, even if you can't concretely get something out of it, is really important. Is this your passion? Do you feel a sense of purpose with this? It's a lot falls on you. There are times in my practice, including the past holiday, where there was a really profound emergency that happened, for example. You have to be able to be available to those things. And when it's a passion and a purpose for you, it carries you. This is a field that you have to be really curious and kind of a lifelong learning mindset. There are things that I can say after 30 years of practice that I just know. And then I also know that the bigger truth is I can get easily blinded by my 30 years of what I know and not see something. And so the more experience I have, the more vigilant I have to be about being open to what I don't know. It's not like, oh, I've done that, been there, done that. There's always evolving things in this field, which makes it really exciting. And no two patients are ever alike, even though you might have, worked with depressed people thousands of hours. Everyone is different. So trying to keep that, I think, really helps me stay alive as a private practitioner. Um, Being an independent person that enjoys working independently is really important in private practice. I find that very easy to do given who I am, but that would be the one thing I hear a lot of people are surprised to learn about themselves. They miss the group work, they miss the teamwork, they miss the collaboration with other colleagues. They want to be able to have a lunch break where they can chat with colleagues, for example. They find the biggest complaint I hear with students who go into private practice and who aren't happy with it or aren't successful with it is that they find it super isolating. And so there can be a way that, patient after patient, I can think of some of my longest clinical days where I've had 8 or more patients in a day. And it's one person after another where your focus is solely on that person. If you're somebody that feels really sapped by that and you need to have more engagement, think carefully about whether this is right for you, or think carefully about how big you want your private practice to be. It rarely happens to me in that way anymore, or in general. And I think probably the balance I have of the academia as well as private practice helps with that. So it's not all solely dependent on my private practice. But I remember one day after a long day of private practice, and it was really intense stuff where I was super focused on the other. And I remember wandering into the suite next to my office, and I'm chatting away with the receptionist, and I'm like, "What the heck am I doing here?" And I think it really was, you don't realize how isolating it can get. It's stuff that we can't really share with others. So be mindful of that. Having leadership is really important in being a private practitioner. You have to have some vision, foresight. You have to be thinking ahead. Everything falls on you. So for those of you who are in a practicum, um, if something goes wrong, it can be attributed to the site. When it's in your own private practice, it all falls on you and it's attributed to you. So be mindful of that. I think there's also in private practice this blend of being both empathic and feeling oriented, but also pragmatic and organized is really important. So you got to get statements out, you got to get billing out, you've got to conform to the regulations, those kinds of things. That's related to that self-motivation and self initiative and self-discipline. Again, that all falls on you. You have to be able to get the billing out in time. You have to have scheduling, all of that. Um, and like I said, being able to have a business-minded and entrepreneurial spirit is really important. You have to be persistent. You have to be focused. It takes a while to build up a successful private practice. Being able to see opportunities, some risk taking, all of that good stuff. So I think those are things that we don't always hear about as practitioners. And you can be a really great practitioner, but if you don't have some of these business kind of skills and leadership skills, then your practice um, oftentimes is not as successful as you may want it to be or need it to be. So, um, any questions there? Okay. Okay. So, professional development and training. Yeah, Bianca, hi.
It just came to me. I was thinking, hi, Dr. Marlo. Hi, everyone. Bianca. I was wondering, how does this change if we're working alongside someone else in a private practice?
Yeah, great question. And I'll go into some of that a little later, but
Okay.
generally speaking, I think that's one option that people find if they don't want to be solely isolated, they join like a group private practice. And so you in group private practice, there's a little different model where you might be working with a group and you're all benefiting from the resources. There's usually a sharing of, so usually the fee structure is different. And so you're contributing to the group and the collective. So unlike in private practice where you get all of it, you farm it out to the group. And so if there's a group practice owner, they will have a different fee structure that's very different than an individual. Sometimes people are shocked by the fee split, but the fee split is pretty standard and pretty fair. Most people, and we'll get into this later, aren't aware of all the costs of having a private practice. So when you're like, wait, I'm only going to get X percent of every hour I see, um, it's for the most part pretty going rate and pretty fair for the group practitioner who's taking on all the responsibility, who has to get the insurance, who has to pay for the suites, the rent, all that. We'll cover all that. But generally there's that pragmatic end. And then there's also if you're part of a group practice, you have to abide by their norms and their policies, that type of thing, versus if you're a solo practitioner where you kind of set all that. Does that help, Bianca?
Thank you, Dr. Marlo.
Yeah, yeah. So I always say, and this is where, those of you that are here at NDNU's program, I think you're fortunate to have this, is take advantage of the academic and the professional opportunities. That's one reason why we hold today, and all day. Yes, Kevin.
I was just curious on how you talked about needing to know yourself. In your own experience, did you find that some of the qualities you talked about that would lead to professional and private practice, were they innate to you, or were these things you noticed evolving over time as you went through your training and developed your professional um, presence, I guess, in the field?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think my answer, which probably won't surprise you, Kevin, is a both and. I think there are some innate things, but I also think people, when you don't expose yourself and flex that muscle, um, then you don't know. And so one of the things that I've said to any of you that have come to me for advising and the way I've tried to run and lead this program is do not get pigeonholed too early on. Do not narrow your focus. At this phase, get as many experiences as you can because you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what you might be good at and what you might enjoy. And so oftentimes it's easy to go, oh, I'm just innately this way, or this is me. And if you don't have that experience, until you get into the experience, you might not realize, oh my God, I love working with people that struggle with addiction, or I love working with little kids and I never thought I would, or oh my God, I come alive with teenagers. My teenage years were horrible. I thought I'd be horrible with teens, but I'm really great. I hear those stories all the time. So I think this is one of those fields that if you take advantage and you get involved in a array of things, that's really good. And then you can go, nope, I'm right. I don't like working with teens, and I tried it, and nope, that's not for me. Or you might be surprised and go, oh my God, I do. So I think there's a lot to be said for we don't have experience with these things, and that's probably the best teacher. And so to say innately, like, I'm not going to be able to work with someone who abused their child, you don't know that until you experience that. That's a judgment, you know? So I think what I would say is try to find that sweet spot of knowing yourself and challenging yourself enough to get outside your comfort zone, but not also challenging yourself so much that trusting in some of the knowing you have. Does that make sense?
It does, yes. It kind of reminds me of that zone of proximal learning where you know yourself enough that you can take on this challenge and not be overwhelmed by it, but yet not limit yourself too much that you're not growing.
Exactly. That's a great way.
Okay.
That's a great way of holding it, Kevin. Yeah. Wonderful. Okay. Well, few other things, like I said, so really expose yourself to as many experiences as you can. The more you do that before you get licensed, the better. After you get licensed, being able to get as many experiences is important as well, and trying to keep those connections with your professors, your supervisors, your mentors. You know, most of us really love to most of us really love to stay in touch with students and with people that are out in the field. I always look at all of you are going to be my colleagues very soon, and I really treasure that. It's hard for me at this point, given the number of students I've taught, to always stay connected. So I love it when students reach out to me. I say this to all the time. Please let me know if you open a private practice. I'm always looking to give out referrals. I get requests for referrals all the time, but if I don't know what you're doing, I can't do that. So never hesitate. If it's a true mentor, if it's somebody that really cares about you, they're going to want to hear about you. They might not be able to write a 3-paragraph email, but we care. So stay connected, and develop those circle of supports in your training. So your practicum class, for example, people that you traveled through classes with. Many times students will tell me years later, after they've been established, that they still connect with their practicum group, for example, or people that were sort of in their cohort. Like I mentioned, go general, get as wide of experience as you can, but do start to cultivate a focused interest. It's a start, but so go general, but try to cultivate a focused interest. That can later translate in private practice to an area of expertise that you have. Okay. Um, so just yesterday, someone called me and said, I had been referred to you, and here's what's going on. And it was an issue related to perinatal health, for example. And that was that's an area of focus that I've cultivated over many decades. So those are kind of ways where I'll see a lot of people generally, but then there's certain niche areas that you have that draw people. Okay. And then there's always postgraduate fellowships, internships, trainings. Dr. Bukhari and I get notices nearly every day about these, and we try to post them weekly in our Talent Tuesday e-newsletter. So keep your eyes peeled for that. We're always trying to keep you up to date with what are some trainings and opportunities. One of the things people sometimes apply to this model is, let me just check off the boxes and get my degree and get out. That's one way of doing it, but it's not generally the way that will lead you to being a very successful private practitioner. People will come back to you, and people will pay you because they're getting something valuable from you. And if it's check all the boxes and let me just hang up my shingle, and you don't have richer sources of knowledge or more specialized skills, then people don't usually stay with you, and people, will seek someone else that is more knowledgeable, more trained. So, I did consultations. I paid for consultations, which were very expensive, but it really paid off because it made me a better practitioner. I paid for years and years of my own therapy, my own analysis, my own supervision, my own consultation, advanced training groups. I probably had more advanced training postgraduate school than I had in graduate school. And so all of that really comes back to supporting you in the practice because people um, realize you have a really highly valuable service to offer. Okay. So these are some of the training suggestions I have about pursuing training in a couple of select areas, engaging in professional consultation, be it individual and group. Okay. Any questions there?
Can you tell us more, like what a fellowship is? You mentioned like there's fellowships and things when you do when you graduate. What are those?
Yeah, so like at the Psychotherapy Institute or the Community Institute for Psychology or the Young Institute, there can be trainingship years or fellowship years where there might be a focus on certain things. At UCSF, there was parent, child, infant trauma training fellowships. So they're typically a training year where there's a focus in a certain area that you might be interested in, and so you can do some research on that. But they might be training people in an area that might need more attention. Maybe there is training on LGBTQ fellowship, for example, of working with individuals um, um, around a variety of issues that are more pertinent there. There might be a training in psychopharmacology and mental health, a training on trauma, those kinds of things. So they're usually advanced years that require you to put in hours and work, but you're also getting more education by experts in that focused area.
Thank
Uh,
you.
yeah, Joshua, hi.
Hi, sorry, it's me, Sophia. Joshua's my husband.
I know. Sorry about that. I'm like, oh, wait a minute. I just saw, and I was like, wait a minute. Now I saw you. Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. I gotta figure out how to change the name. That's on me. Follow-up question to the fellowship question. Can you do research with your master's as a licensed therapist, or do you need to get a doctorate?
Absolutely. There are a lot of opportunities for doing research with your masters. In fact, many times people with masters are hired more frequently because there's only so many positions. Typically, people with a doctorate tend to be the leads on a grant or the leads on a project or the lab manager or the project manager. But many of our students, including people that went just through our MSCP program, the 37 unit program, which does not make you eligible to pursue a license. One of the big reasons why we kept and still keep that degree is for people to be able to work in lab settings. And so when you go to a research institution, and Notre Dame is not a research institution, we're very much a teaching and training institution, but you go to places that have a lot of research dollars and a lot of research staff. And that's what I was saying earlier. They often don't have the teaching and the training and the applied stuff. But you'll have, like at UCSF or at Stanford or the VA, you'll have a number of big grants there. And so there's a lot of ways that with your MS, you're able to get involved in being part of a research study. So I would suggest, coordinating with the director or the coordinator of the research and seeing what options are available.
Oh, and is that something you can do alongside private practice, or is that like a full-time?
Absolutely. It depends on the project, of course, but usually they'll have, especially if you're not in a lead role, then usually they'll have like, the need for someone, they might have a need for somebody for 10 hours or 20 hours or filling in with a variety of research ways. So it just kind of really depends on the research lab and the institution. But that's one of the good things about private practice is you can structure your practice on certain days and at certain times and then integrate other things in. So,
Yeah. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so some basic foundations of practice. I'll dive into that now. Um, okay. Um, all right. So one of the things that I think really is important to understand, and so for anybody here that's in the program or for anybody here who's a professional out in the field that joined us today, again, welcome. Um, when you work in an organization or when you're a trainee, when you're working at a practicum site, and when you're in an academic site, it's a very different mentality, the private practice mentality. And so some of the ways it's different is that there's the institutional transference versus the personal transference. So, if you're like, oh, I can blame that on name the institution, any of the institutions you're training at. Um, People can attribute it to that. When it's all on you, it's a really different experience, and it requires you to again have that integrity, have that organization, have that energy, have that business-minded but empathic feeling sense. What you are competent to do at an institution, you may not be competent to do in private practice. So I've certainly learned that lesson the hard way, where I trained at a variety of settings from community clinics to VA hospitals, Kaiser, private medical facilities, medical, emergency rooms, community mental health centers, you name it. And one of the things that's easy to forget is all you get from the institution and all you get from working on a team. So someone that I might be able and competent to work with at the VA hospital, I'm not able to see him in my outpatient private practice because the kind of supports that he needs at the VA hospital, the kind of groups, the kind of med management, the kind of other paraprofessionals or professionals that support this person, it creates it creates splintered care, and you're not able to get those things from the institution. So be careful about, if you work in a setting and you take someone on and they have a lot of high risk needs, that's often not the best fit for a private practice because you're not going to have that 24/7 care or that follow-up or the emergency facilities or the range of professionals to refer to. So that's just something to be really mindful of. And if you love doing that work, you might think about staying at an institution and maybe having a really small select private practice, for example. So just be mindful of those kind of things of all you get out of working in an institution because you don't have that when you're in private practice. Yeah, Bianca.
Is there a way to balance nonprofit and a private practice? And what's
Absolutely. Yeah, and that was exactly what I was just saying there. Like you can call your own hours there. And so most people that I know begin private practice that way. They start at a nonprofit or they start at another institution, and then they start to build their practice while they're working at another institution. And then, they find the percentage that's right for them. Some people want to stay at the nonprofit and have a private practice. Some people eventually pivot out of the nonprofit and go full-time private practice. And then some people go, you know what, I'm going to stay in the nonprofit. That's a much better gig for me. And I much prefer that over doing my own thing. So that's again, those things that you just sometimes don't know except through experience. So absolutely, that's one of the things you can do as a private practitioner. And I'll give you some pointers in just a minute on how you might integrate that better so that you have a more successful outcome. Okay. So we'll get into that in a bit. Like I mentioned, you need to have, if you go into private practice, and this was something that really helped me as a private practitioner. By the time I got private licensed and in private practice, I had worked at so many different settings and I had worked with so many different people. And you just never know when someone calls who is going to walk through your door and what they're going to need. And so if you're not broadly trained and you're not widely trained, you're not going to be able to help the people that see you. And guess what? That person is going to go out and say, that person was an idiot, or that person didn't help me at all. Or nowadays we have so much Yelp and thumbs up and thumbs down. A lot of times people can rate you really harshly, especially in an online environment. So if you don't have a good, solid general experience plus a special focus, that might not come for a while. But if you're solidly well trained, that's a good start. And then if you have a focus, then that can help drive people with a certain focus to you. Keep in mind, though, that that focus may or may not be relevant to why they're coming to see you. They might think it is, but you have enough knowledge in that area to know whether or not that's true. So, for example, somebody might come to my office and say they had a traumatic childbirth, but that there might really be another issue going on that they come to me because they know I have experience with that. And as I'm working with them, I'm realizing, oh no, the issues that are really at play here might be substance abuse, or might be a psychosis, or might be bipolar disorder, something like that. So you have to, again, be able to be generally trained enough, but also have your own thing. So, and that's where knowing yourself as a practitioner and considering the fit with potential referrals, how does that line up for you? Um, Watch the temptation when you're building a practice to accept people that are really not good fits for you. It can be a really costly professional and costly business decision if you take someone on that's a real risk to your practice and that is outside of your scope of practice, really. Okay. Um, don't forget, and this is easy to forget as practitioners, our licenses are very general. You get licensed as an MFT, an LPCC. That basically says you can work with anybody. That's not true in practice, though. I mean, it's technically true, but that's what can get you into hot water. So only you can police yourself and know yourself about your scope of practice. And if you've never seen somebody taking that on because now you're licensed, it can be really risky. And so I recommend, I recommend that you seek more consultation, seek education, seek supervision. It doesn't mean you can't pivot into new areas, not at all. It just means that it's easy once you get licensed to think, okay, I can see anyone and everyone that walks through my doors, and that's really not true and can get you into a lot of challenges, especially as a practitioner. And if something goes poorly in the person's treatment, um, and it leads to some kind of conflict or complaint or challenge to the board or lawsuit, you're going to be grilled on how much experience you have with someone around with those kinds of issues, whether you're licensed or not. Okay. So, so getting known is really important in professional networks. And so that involves, putting yourself out there. If, so being able to go to professional groups, being able to be part of your professional community or your local community, being part of a group that, if you're really interested in somatic experiencing, which is a somatic form of therapy, you might start to get connected with other people that are learning and training in those same things. Many of us, myself included, I did this for a long time. I'm not doing it right now, but I would run consultation groups for people that were newly licensed or had been licensed for a while, but just new to private practice. So you can find really great consultation groups. You could make your own consultation groups from the people in your practicum class, for example, or from trusted friends and colleagues. Continued education is great. I have taught for many, many years at the Young Institute in what they call their year-long or extended classes. So a year-long training is where they'll have about 20 practitioners, and you all meet together once a week or once a month, whatever whatever the schedule is. But you work together with other practitioners for a year, and those bonds can become really strong, and those people become people you refer to. I always say it's great to meet other clinicians that are not like you, because then you have other people to refer to who, if you don't do something, then you have someone else to refer to, and we learn from them, and vice versa. They don't do what you do, then and then you're able to really refer back and forth. Engaging in professional activities outside of private practice for those of you that are here today that are not part of NDNU. This is a great example of getting known in other areas and getting known in other communities, and then people remember you and will refer patients to you. Another way to get to build your professional network, and this is something I certainly did at the beginning of my practice, is to engage in contract work. So there can be a number of agencies that I think, Bianca, you asked earlier about this, that might say, we're looking for someone to do supervision of our interns for 8 to 10 hours a week. That's contract work that you can do while you're building your private practice. So then you get to be known by that agency. You get to be known by other students. You get to be known by other practitioners. Or maybe, a senior psychology center says, we want you to go into nursing homes and work with our seniors 10 hours a week. That's contract related work. So you can do things like that and integrate that with private practice as well. And that builds your skills, that builds your knowledge, that builds all those kind of things that you're going to need to know in order to serve more patients and therefore be able to accept more referrals. Another way is nowadays listservs are very, very popular. So becoming involved in listservs, you get to learn who's out there and, you know, um, you know, um, I got a referral yesterday. I got on my listserv, I got someone asking referrals for something really select around a 2-year-old who was having night terrors, for example. You're going to see that. And when you're part of an active listserv, you'll get to know who's out there and who's got these really niche areas. Who can you refer to? Who do you want to meet? Most practitioners I found are, like you, eager to connect and build their network. And so, they're often really receptive to you saying, hey, I saw your work in X, Y, and Z. I'd love to learn more. Or, can we have coffee? Can you do a Zoom call? Can we set up a time to get together? Or similarly, I also have that area. I don't know other people with this interest. Um, I'd love to set up a time to connect. So that can be a really great way to do it. The other thing I do, and this for me comes out of just providing excellent clinical care to the people in my practice, is I make a point, and it's time consuming, but it makes a difference. I make a point to know the other major professionals in my patient's life. So if I'm working with a patient and they have, a neurologist and they have a internist, certainly if they have a psychiatrist, if they have an occupational therapist, maybe they're working with a music therapist or a dance therapist. If they're getting other kinds of therapy, I really make it a point to set up a time to talk with each of those practitioners. I do that because it's best for my patient to make sure we're all on the same page. But what it also just naturally does is people get to know you that way. People respect the quality of work, they respect the care you're doing, they respect your integrity as a clinician, and then they remember you and they go, oh, so and so has an expertise in this and that. So that's how you can naturally build your networks as well, by simply by being a good clinician, taking good care of the patients that are coming to you. So websites are certainly really popular these days. So designing a good website, knowing people that way, LinkedIn and other social media are great ways of getting known. A lot of therapists these days are doing TikToks and those sort of things. I think that's still allowed in the US at this point, who knows? But at any rate, whatever is going on there, but the different forms of social media, those can be other ways of dealing with, of getting known. Psychology Today is a really popular site. A lot of people are on Psychology Today. And there are other sites that some people like better than Psychology Today. And so you can poke around at all that stuff. Be sure to be really conscious about social media and electronic networking. A lot of people have had challenges with that. And so just be mindful of what you're putting out there and how you use it and what that may attract to you. Okay. Okay. Um, all right. So, some nuts and bolts around referrals and accepting, making, and responding to referrals. So one of the things I've always emphasized in my law and ethics class is that you get knowledgeable of the local, national, and even international sources of support. So I've built up quite a library of supports and resources over the years. And so I think it's really important to do that because when people come your way, you might say to them, I don't think I'm the right person for you, but let me help you get to the right person. That is, again, very memorable to people. And even if, so clearly you're not benefiting from it, but that goes a long way. Be mindful of people that work similarly and differently from you. The responsiveness, like I mentioned, matters. Acknowledge and thank your referral sources. So that frequently gets lost. And as a practitioner, sometimes when I refer someone out, or I always like knowing that there was a follow-up, and so that makes you remember. You have to be mindful of confidentiality. You don't want to violate confidentiality. So there's certainly ways of just simply saying to someone, thank you for the referral, and leaving it at that. And most of the time people know, although I know for myself, sometimes I make so many referrals that I'm like, what is this referring to? I have no idea what they're talking about. Another way to do it is what I do in my consent form is I just have a line at the bottom of my consent form and I say, I give Helen Marlo permission to inform the referral source that I have followed up with this referral. And so it's really simple. And so in that way, most of the time the person doesn't care, but technically you have to get their permission to do that because of confidentiality and revealing that they did follow up. But, in my experience, a gastroenterologist that referred somebody to me and wanted to make sure, that this patient followed up with their care and didn't want to intrude into their psychology and their life, but is deeply worried about his patient. It goes a long way to just be able to say, Susie Smith followed up with me. Thank you for this referral, or thank you for thinking, thank you for your concern about her, and leave it at that. I usually have a conversation with every patient, and if another practitioner, another professional is worried and concerned and sent me their way, invested enough to send their way, I just have a conversation with them and say, is it okay for me to thank Dr. X? Is it okay for me to just let Dr. X know you're here? I don't share anything more, but it goes a long way to building referrals and to building a reputable, your reputation and a reputable practice. Okay. Um, okay. So modern practice nowadays. So the presentation I would have given even 10 years ago is different than what I would give now, thanks to pandemic and COVID and so forth. So with pragmatics, some things to think about are the location is what works for you. So be mindful of, do you want to work in your community? Do you want to work outside of your community? There might be some pros and cons. There are pros and cons to each. So, if you're really well known in a community, you might want to choose someplace a little farther. On the other hand, you might really want to just stay in your community and that's why you're here. So you have to think of ways to work with the inevitable, running into people that you might treat or know. So think about that. The convenience can have pros and cons. You need to check zoning regulations. You also need to check with your insurance if you're able to practice in certain locations. And so be mindful of that, including if you decide to completely set up a completely virtual practice. That's a really evolving area. There's still a lot of unknown there. And so you just need to make sure, because you need to make sure that if you're collecting insurance, that you can operate out of your home or operate completely remotely. There's all these different rulings now, and so it's really important to know about that. I know even when I was in Burlingame, I was kind of forced out of my private practice building when it was kind of at the height of .com craziness. And I moved to another street in Burlingame, and it was a building that a lot of practitioners were in and had been in a long time. And I didn't think to check the zoning regulations, and moved in and found out after moving in that the building was not technically zoned for for people in our field. And so then I later learned the city of Burlingame was going after people that were in buildings that they were not zoned to do. I wound up moving into this building and moving out within, I think, 2 months when I learned all of this. So I met with the landlord and, I just let him know, I'm sorry, but you didn't let me know about that your meeting, your building's not zoned for this. And are you aware that this is happening and this is happening and this is happening? And he knew, he understood, and he let me out of the lease. But things like that, you need to be mindful of where you're setting up. So, Julia, yeah.
I was just wondering, like, what exactly are zoning regulations?
So when you go into a private practice and you rent a space, you need to check with the landlord to say, is this zoned for people that are practicing psychotherapy? Because psychotherapy falls under a certain category in the business and professional code. And if you zone a building and it's only supposed to be for certain kinds of professionals, then technically you're not supposed to practice there. At the time that I ran into this problem, which was, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, I was technically considered a medical professional, even though there's no medical waste, there's no anything. Um, I don't know if that has changed since COVID, but at the time, I'm currently in a building that's zoned for medical professionals, and so I've never had a problem. But at that time, even though there's no medical waste in what we do, I was technically considered a medical professional, and I could not practice in that building because it wasn't zoned for that. So that was something that I found out and learned through the landlord. And the city was actually going to private practitioners and finding them thousands of dollars for setting up shop in a building they weren't supposed to set up shop in. That was worse 10 years ago, pre-COVID, where it was really hard to find a small private practice space. The COVID has totally changed that. Now they're begging for people to take their spaces. Um, but I was in a situation, I was been in several situations where it was really hard to find office space in the areas I was living in, and I did diligent searches. And so people they'd hear that a small space was open and they'd move in, but it wasn't zoned for what we're doing, basically. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yeah. So in terms of telemental health, I think I will just keep it really simple because the regulations are always evolving and I don't know what they will be like when you're in this position. And if you're in it now, I'd highly encourage you to look at any laws and restrictions and what's the current thinking on that. The things you have to really be mindful of are what city, the local proximity, the state laws, and your private practice insurance and licensure regulations. Do all of those allow that? And so if they don't, then you have to abide by what your insurance regulations, your licensure, your state, your community, those regulations. Okay, and it's really an evolving area. So be mindful of that. Some people that are just saying, I'm not even going to get an office at all. You need to check with your insurer. You need to check with your licensing board. Is that okay? And what changes do you have to make in the billing and so forth if you're doing it that way? Yeah, Bianca.
I just want to make sure I'm understanding the zoning regulations. They not only apply to commercial um to like businesses, but it also applies to residential. So if we're practicing out of our home.
So if you're yeah, so if you practice as an NFT or LPCC, like I mentioned, you're a business owner now, whether you choose to incorporate or not, and that's probably beyond the scope of what I should talk about today. But some people choose to do it, and some people don't. Um, but at any rate, you're a business owner, and if you're operating out of your home, for example, the county of San Mateo, pre-pandemic said you can't operate a private practice out of your home, that violated the residential zoning laws. Okay, so yeah, so even when I was, like I said, 2017, 2018, things were, real estate was really hard to come by. And so I even looked at the feasibility of having an office out of my home. And the zoning laws said I couldn't do that, basically. So you need to check residential. If you're going to operate your business out of your home, does your county of residence allow that or not? Now, many people still operate their business out of their home and they're taking a risk there, right? So many people do that, and that's for you to decide whether you're going to abide by that or not, right? But there can be consequences if you don't abide by the zoning regulations, right? So just be aware of that. A lot of people feel like, oh, I can do this out of my home, but people have regulations about that too. So,
Thank you.
yeah. And I think there's been some changes since COVID and with the much more widespread acceptance of working from home. But so that's why I don't want to, best to check with the authorities that do all this, right? So when you have an office, keep in mind that first impressions can matter. So when people are stressed or worried, upset, they judge a book by the cover. So I always say to, invest in your private practice, because that can color initial impressions. And so, how does the space reflect you and your practice? Yeah, Dawn.
Hi, sorry, my finger's going off. When you're talking about like working at home and having a practice at home, do people mostly do telehealth now at home? When you say home, or are people still having like clients come to their home?
Both.
Mhm.
Yeah, both. So
Okay.
both, yeah. So people can do both of those things. So
How do you feel about that? Like I've thought about that, for the future, but I thought, do I really want clients in my home? I don't know if I would want people to know where I live. There's
yeah,
risky things about that, I guess.
yeah. I totally understand that, Dawn. I think it's an individual decision, honestly, for each person, and it really depends on the kind of practice you have. Um, I know that I think one of the things that I am seeing and I get concerned about is that many of you trained and are getting into the field during COVID or early post-COVID. And so that really shifted and changed a lot of the training. And for those of us that were able, like myself, to make an easy pivot around telehealth, I think people don't realize, I had 25 years of experience before I made that pivot. And I think that's really different than people that are brand new to the field. Again, I'm not trying to say, do as I say, not as I do kind of thing. But I think it's very different when you've had that long of a leash. Um, it's also different because many of the patients that I have known them for 25, 30 years. That's going to shape whether I feel comfortable or not with them coming to my home or doing a telehealth visit, those kinds of things. So I think that's why I would encourage people to have a physical space at this stage. You just don't know. And if you have worries about that, until I've cultivated a more trusting relationship, that's one of the things that would be top of my mind. Um, you know, um, at my practice, I had a crisis over the holidays, and a patient that I've worked with and known for 30 years. Um, it was right over the holidays, and there was no services, buildings were closed, and I felt like the best thing to do. It was a very, very awful crisis that happened, was to have her come to my home office. And so that was not a problem. It was emergency services, it was warranted, all those kinds of things. So again, you have to think about those sort of things, I think. But I think that if you don't have any other choice, and a lot of therapists are going, I just want to go on the cheap. I'm just going to do it out of my home and do it telehealth. Just make sure you know, think about how that can limit your practice and make sure you're in the regulations. But I think it really depends on the kind of practice you have and the relationships you have. There are certain patients that I can say still after 30 years, I would not treat them from my home. And that's just me. I like to have that separation. And that's why I continue to have an office in San Mateo. There's several other patients that I can easily think, no problem, they can easily come to my home. That for me, I think it's really different with each person, but I think you ultimately have to do what's right for the patient and not just what's convenient for yourself, because that goes down a slippery slope, right? So, being connected with your suite mates, one thing to keep in mind, there have been class action lawsuits that if somebody asked about a group practice, if members of your group are involved in unethical or illegal activity, may not be fair, may not be right, but it happens that the whole group can be sued. And so, keep that in mind. I remember checking out Office Space years ago, and the person that was interviewing me she gave me really weird vibes. I later found out that she had been having sex with her patients in that office, and that every single practitioner in that office were part of this class action lawsuit. And I was so glad I didn't rent space from her. So, anyway, things like that so just be really mindful of who are you practicing with? Do you trust them? I have typically only been in suites with people that I trusted, that type of thing. So think about the investment you're making in furniture and supplies. It can be a very wise investment. Per most of our ethics codes, you got to make sure that your safety, that it's set up to preserve confidentiality, including there's the so-called two-lock system. So is there a lock in the waiting room? That's usually preferable. If not, is there a lock on your door? And then is there a lock on your filing cabinet? So you have to have two locks between you and your records ethically. That's a sort of board standard. So if your notes get burglarized or your notes are left out and are not secured in a safe place, they usually use the two lock standard. One of the things that I felt like I became a mini expert at without wanting to be was acoustics and soundproofing. A while ago, I don't think it's gotten much better, but again, it was really hard to find office spaces, but the spaces that you would have available, the sound would travel, and it was in just crazy loud. You could literally hear people in the next room. One of the things to just watch for is the ceiling. So a lot of ceilings are not real in Bay Area buildings, and so the sound will travel over the top of the ceiling and into the next room. So I would hang egg crates, I would hang foam, I would hang blankets, I would put in sound machines. So before you sign on that lease, make sure you check the sound, because if patients can feel that they're being heard, or you can walk by a room and hear what's happening, that usually doesn't build a lot of trust, and it's a blatant confidentiality violation. So like I mentioned with telehealth, there's evolving standards and regulations. Who knows where it'll be when you come out? For those of you that are out right now, make sure you're checking, make sure you're HIPAA compliant, abiding by the licensing laws and practices. Keep in mind that malpractice insurance coverage does not usually extend across state lines. So if you're seeing someone in another state, in addition to not being licensed in that state, which is a violation, your insurance may not cover. Your malpractice insurance will likely not cover you. So if a crisis happens with that person and any kind of malpractice thing happens across state lines, then you have challenges and problems from your licensing board as well as your malpractice carrier. Okay. Some of the basics that you need are an intake form, an informed consent, some kind of assessment or mental status exam, a treatment plan, and release of information. You may or may not choose to use all of these in your private practice. Certainly in most institutions, you're familiar with this. I would say some of the most important ones, once you're in private practice, are the intake, the informed consent, and the release of information form. So those you have to make up. There's certain standards and certain recommendations about what should be in those forms. And you can get that, of course, from your licensing licensing agency, your professional organization, and then many organizations will offer like almost kits, therapist kits of forms that have everything you need in them. So those can be really helpful. I always think it's nice from the private practice standpoint to personalize it to being, to having your own imprint. Okay. Some of the pragmatics is knowing your availability and your regularity. So if you travel a lot, if you're gone a lot, you don't want to build a practice with people that rely on you week after week. You would want to do shorter term or less intensive therapy or assessments. You want to really hone your practice into the kind of practice that you are building and your availability that way. What kind of contact, including electronic, can they make with you? Evolving email and text practices. So keep in mind that if you use those to communicate with people, and your records ever need to be subpoenaed, that all of that material is discoverable. And so you want to be really mindful of what you're putting in those and how you're using those, including if it's a legitimate use. How are you set up for emergencies? Another big thing is setting your fee policy. What kind of fees are you going to charge? So you have typically, most of us have to have a standard full fee, and then we can decide if we're going to have a sliding scale or not. The way I've done it oftentimes is I've set my full fee, and then I look at what's my range of sliding scale going to be. And then I look at what's my low fee. And I always save a couple places in my practice for really low fee, as well as a certain number of spots for a sliding scale. So I kind of have that in my head, and I know, can I take a person on who can't afford my full fee or not? So you have to look at that yourself. It's like your own business plan. You look at, what you can afford or not afford, what you need or don't need. But that can be a way of maintaining your practice with more business integrity. How are you going to record keep? Most of you were trained in the age of electronic record keeping. I was not. I still am old-fashioned and I use paper records, but a lot of my practitioners really love to do that. Keep in mind that when you are using electronic records, you have to be very mindful of when you log in, the regularity, that there's an electronic footprint, all of that. So again, you can keep paper or electronic, it doesn't really matter, but it's important that you're keeping those records. That actually was not a requirement until about 20 or so years ago, and now it is. So yeah, Tony.
Do you recommend any like online, like websites or electronic resources that are valid, like very very solid for electronic record keeping, that are like safe and like protect
Yeah.
records?
I would say the one that I hear from students, and is the most popular, is Simple Practice. And one of the things I would say that probably makes more sense, is that most of the therapist record keeping software is a package deal. So I would say, they have your appointments, they have your financing, you have your scheduling, you have the record keeping all in one computer program. I think that probably makes a lot more sense. I've never used one of those. I still don't, and I don't really like using those. Um, and so I'm not under one system. I like the flexibility of running it in the way I'd like to. But if you are going to use one of those programs, I would say use one that includes the record keeping, because then it's all synthesized, which is the goal, which is why most people like that. So that makes sense? Sherry.
I'm wondering, so you said that the record keeping wasn't a requirement till about 20 years ago. And I think a lot of us are frustrated by all the different record keeping requirements at organizations that we're working at. And I'm wondering which records are either legally or if not through the law, through the professional codes required, as opposed to just discretionary based on an individual practitioner's choice.
Yeah, great question. And what I would say, having been in the field for over 30 years now, even when every time I've worked at an institution, records were always required. Okay. Just FYI, even though it wasn't a legal thing, but a lot of private practitioners in that world where you could do your own thing, a lot of my old-timey practitioners and supervisors were like, oh, I don't keep any records. I can remember everything. Well, that all changed when the business and professional code said you have to have something. So to my knowledge, as a private practitioner, you're supposed to keep your consent. So what I had said, the key important things, those are the ones that are more legally sought for. You need to have a record of every visit. There is the protected health kind of stuff, as well as the progress versus the process. And you can decide through your own note keeping how much you want to integrate that or keep it separate. I've kind of kept it integrated at this point, but I'm just mindful of what I include in the record, if it's ever, subpoenaed or whatever. So you need to have typically you should keep legally any reflection of the clinical treatment. So once you accept certain forms in like texts or those kinds of things, then technically you're accepting that as part of the clinical treatment, and that can be discoverable in a court of law. So you'll get a subpoena or something that says, please produce everything. That said, as many of you may know, you can work with the requesting party and to say, hey, wait a minute, I haven't seen this patient in 10 years, or what's the nature of this? And you can negotiate with them to only release certain things. But it has to be negotiated and agreed upon. You can't just unilaterally decide, hey, I don't feel like giving this note or this piece. So technically, anything that's part of the clinical treatment is to be kept in the record. And that can be the informed consent, that can be the weekly or, a note for each visit. You don't technically have to have like certain things that you're required to do at agencies, certain checklists or certain treatment plans, those things that the agency needs to justify funding more often than not. As a private practitioner, that's not what you have to do, basically. So I hope that answers.
Well, sort of, but I just like a little bit of a follow-up. So like, let's say a progress note. I know you use the SOAP format of some organizations use the BURP format. Is there a legal requirement beyond just documenting that the patient showed up and you saw them on that date? Is there somewhere where it says you must include certain elements, or is that just what people have decided were best practices, or they're trying to cover themselves or whatever? Is there a list anywhere, or is it set out what is required and not discretionary?
Yeah, generally speaking, so that's both a legal and an ethical question, and so the law didn't specify what has to be in because they figure you as the ethical practitioner should delineate that. But the ethics codes will say, here are things that should be in the notes. And so typically it's things like the presenting complaint, what you worked on, their symptoms, and the treatment and the follow-up. And that's why I use that's why SOAPy and burp notes and all that, they follow the general thing, but it's not a hard and fast concrete thing like you must have this in every note, because that doesn't reflect clinical reality, right? And so even in a case I had where the patient committed a crime and it involved a lot of negotiating and collaborating with the prosecuting attorney as well as the defense attorney. There were certain things where, I remember in reviewing my notes, there was one week I didn't have an assessment of something. And, one of the things I could just say was if it wasn't there, then it means there was nothing notable. So there's a lot of leeway you have. It's not like, they're grilling you for you didn't dot every I and cross every T. And you as the practitioner again can say, if that was significant, I would have mentioned that in the note. You have that leeway. So there are it's not as hard and fast because I think that doesn't reflect clinical reality. I want to give the licensed person the autonomy to say, yes, I was representing it accurately. And just because it wasn't necessarily in the note doesn't mean I didn't do these sort of things and these sort of things. So there's nothing that specific around that. But there are, and you can check general guidelines about best practices. So it's more in that way, and more recommendations like that. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. So some business matters. Um, so, okay. So look at your own relationship to money. This is one area that people often don't do so well in private practice. They, undercharge, or they're not assertive about money, or they overcharge, under or over. It often reflects your own relationship to money. And so looking at what do you need versus what do you aspire to? How can you achieve this? As you're building a practice, are there other ways to support your financial needs? So Bianca, you asked about that. And so you can integrate that with nonprofit work or consulting work or teaching or any research work, any other number of things that reflect your interests and build your skills. And of course, those can become sources of referrals. In terms of business matters, keep in mind that private practice taxes, you tend to, you have to pay self-employment taxes and payroll taxes if you have employees. So the taxes are higher. Generally speaking, I make about 50% of everything I earn in private practice once you factor in taxes. Most people aren't aware of that, okay? So you're going to take home about 50% of your hourly rate. You also are responsible for things like retirement, health insurance, disability, if you're not employed somewhere else. There's also things like the cost of the office and office insurance. Typically, you're also not paid for your paperwork and your administrative time. You're paid by what the patient pays you for that hour. Do you need a business license? Many places you do. Incorporation, I'm not going to really address that. It's a mixed bag, so I'm going to pass over that in the interest of time. Keep in mind that malpractice and professional liability insurance is another expense. Unlike car insurance, your malpractice insurance is cheaper for the first few years of practice, and then it usually plateaus around year 7 or 8. The reason for that is that when you start practicing, again, unlike car insurance, you only have a few patients, so that it's less likely you're going to have claims. As the years go on, the likelihood that someone could make a claim against you grows, and that's why the fee ramps up over the years. But it generally plateaus. I think I pay a couple $1,000s a year or so for my liability and malpractice insurance. And keep in mind when you register or apply for malpractice insurance, you also want to register for paying for if the Board of Psychology or the Board of Behavioral Science ever investigates you. There's board hearings, and so typically you're advised to pay for that rider for board hearings. Most people get insurance coverage of 1 in 3 million for incidences, and then the board investigation rider as well. Some people are now buying riders. I did this myself for cyber crimes and cyber stuff. That's become more prevalent. That's relatively new. I certainly didn't have to deal with that when I was first licensed. In terms of standard fees, important to set your standard. Are you going to be a fee for service practice? Are you going to accept insurance? Will you bill or acceptance? Will you give a sliding scale? All of those things are acceptable, but just make sure your policies are clear. Some of the acceptable forms of payment are cash and check and credit cards. What is not acceptable? Watch out for payment apps. Venmoing, patients Venmoing you, that's a confidentiality breach. I see it happen all the time, and that's not best practices. People can trace that, and people have traced that, and there have been a number of problematic things from people doing PayPal or Venmo or those kinds of things. One thing that is acceptable is Zelle. So Zelle is still a legitimate form. There's also payment sites that will give you payment that way, but keep in mind they take a fairly hefty percentage of that for that service. So be mindful of that. Um, okay. Make sure you have your cancellation policy clear. And the payment choices, are you going to do it at the time of service or do you have a billing system? But being able to be comfortable talking to people about those things and just being really clear and not letting your own anxiety get in the way. And then do you have electronic versus paper and manual record and billing systems? Be very mindful about the electronic ones and having protections on that. For example, I don't have my billing and my electronic payment plan, which I use QuickBooks. I don't have that on my laptop that I bring to the university every day or that I bring to the office. I have it on a separate computer for all those reasons because of the possibility of fraud or financial, that type of thing is just so great. So be really mindful of that. Okay, and Tony, you had asked about some of those things. So here are a number of the electronic record keeping and payment systems that are involved in one that a variety of therapists have really liked. So, okay. Okay, I wanted to stop there. That was a quick run through. Any questions? We have about 15 minutes left. I just wanted to make sure. I know that was a quick run through. I wanted to see um, wanted to see what questions you might have.
Dr. Marlo, I have a question. There's just a lot of, I guess, things that are more like logistical and tactical, like the stuff about that you were just sharing about like the insurance and Zelle being a acceptable form of payment and all that stuff. And I'm guessing that stuff evolves really quickly. And I don't know if you're there, if you know of like a resource that, where you can go with other private practice clinicians and like have like a one-stop shop to find out about the latest. Because I don't know, it seems like a lot of stuff to just track on an ongoing basis. Or are there like groups where people get together and just share that kind of information?
Yeah, and that's where I was saying I think it's really important to be part of you can be part of listservs, you can be part of group consultations. You're going to find like from your practicum site, like the people you're connecting with there, your fellow practitioners, people have Facebook groups. So really building your clinical community, and it's going to evolve over time, and you're going to feel more at home with certain kinds of practitioners. So I would say don't worry right now, but be well connected. And I think it's one of those things that if you are well connected and you're doing some of the other things I mentioned, where you're in listservs, you're in consultation groups, you're with a professional society, you're going to get to know other people, and there's going to be that natural sharing of information. And you're right, it does evolve. And so certain things that are okay now, um, may not be okay later, so I think it's really dependent too on, who your tribe is, who you are, what community you feel safe in, that type of thing. Does that help?
Yeah, it does. I'm sure we'll figure all this out. So try not to get ahead of myself. That's why I was curious about like future resources. So thank you.
And our alumni are great sources of support and resources there. And so many of them, we still have an alumni group, and many people would be happy to share that knowledge. And you'll see that even here in the panel at 1:00, you'll see a number of our folks that, you can certainly even ask them that question. Okay. But many of them too are very happy to have you take their information. And again, if your jam is, ABA therapy, you're going to want to be around more of that tribe. If your jam is doing, more psychodynamic work, you're going to want to be around more people that practice in that way. So it's really finding your tribe and the different resources there too. Does that help? Okay. Max.
Yeah, so when it comes to building like a professional page for yourself in the future to market your own business or even just market yourself to the community, are there any like platforms you need to be mindful of picking or like anything like to be very cautious about with putting like on a professional page or
Um, so anything to be cautious about putting on a professional page? Did you
or
say?
like are there like specific websites that you shouldn't use to like make a professional page or I didn't know if there was any like things you have to be can like consider with that.
Not that I'm aware of, a specific site, but there are certain things just to be mindful of in this field versus other fields. There can be a temptation to um, reveal stuff that really should be more confidential. So like sites that have a patient's name with an endorsement of you, not not good for our profession. That violates confidentiality. Even if the patient says it's okay, you're not really supposed to do that. That's part of the ethical code. So you're unlikely to, be dinged legally for that, but the patient could always change their mind. Say something happens and they get hurt by that, then they could say, well, it was unfair power dynamic. That's very different than being an accountant and you can list somebody who is happy with your services, for example, right? So things like that you have to be more mindful of, more cautious about. I think generally with our field, I err on the side of less information is more, erring on the side of just providing what people need to know, just because it can be misinterpreted in general. But again, I mean, you can look at my website. It combines all the things I do, so I don't have one just for my private practice, um, which has never been a problem for me. But you can take a look at some of the practitioners that you like and respect and see how they've done it. I think that can be really good. But there's not really any formal guidelines, but I would say the biggest thing to worry about is how something you say could be misunderstood or misinterpreted. If you're doing a kind of experimental therapeutic thing, might want to be careful how you promote that on your website, for example, because it could get misunderstood or something, right? Even if it's new and it's experimental, but you're doing a great job with it. There's this catch 22 of you want people to know that, but then it can invite certain misperceptions. So again, you have to decide how much risk you want to take, but those are things I'm always a little more cautious about because things can be misunderstood once put online. So, you might be able to say, yes, I do this, but you might want to have a dialogue with the person there. Things like that are more experimental or outside the box. You got to be careful of how it could be received by somebody, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. And then confidentiality is really important of making sure you don't have places where your patients can leave messages for you and they're visible. For example, one therapist did that and all the patient communications were visible online and they just didn't know what they were doing on their website. So things like that, make sure your technical knowledge, um, you refer it out to the people that know how to do this stuff, or if you know how to do it, make sure it's in accordance with our ethics around confidentiality.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Tony, did you have your question answered? I just saw it now. Oh, Sonia, yes, I'm going to give you the slides. They're also posted in your Canvas, but hold on a minute. Other questions about this? Other nuts and bolts questions? Tony, yeah.
Yeah, my question was just like you mentioned how you can ask your landlord about it. I was just curious if you can like reach out to like, the government, like the local government office to figure out like if what you're doing you can do.
Yes, but I would recommend actually reaching out to your local county. So the county of San Mateo is different than the county of Santa Clara, for example. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. I'm listing these right here. Oops. Sorry about that.
May I ask,
Yes.
just in follow-up to what you mentioned to Max, what about sites where professionals can have a listing where people could look them up, and then they have an option to rate them or do a review. Do you caution clients around, using their actual names for reviews if they're inclined to leave one?
I would, although if a patient is doing it on their own, that's kind of on them and it's not your site, right? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Net has been really hurtful to a lot of people. I know therapists that the patient misrepresented them online and left ratings and things. I know other people where the rating was probably warranted, but it can be a really hard area to get your name removed from. I've worked with a number of people, including literally with some fatal outcomes where what was put about them online, they could not scrub very easily. And so, I just encourage you to think carefully about how you use that and any encouraging of your patient to use that or not. But technically, if it's not your site and they're choosing to do that, that's on them. But that's where you don't want to have some option on your website to encourage that either, right? So the slides are here, as well as another handout that I didn't cover. And these are tips and nuts and bolt things that I put together from over the years. So you can see my presentation is here in the chat, as well as another handout of do's and don'ts. One of the do's and don'ts I mentioned, I forgot to mention, that's really super pragmatic. But if you're getting an office, one of the things to think about is renting more days for shorter periods of time than less days for longer periods of time. Why is that? Well, if you only get 3 or 4 referrals and you only have Wednesday available, you've now lost a referral. And if you're able to negotiate a couple of days and blocks of time, it often winds up being the same amount of the same cost, but you now have more flexibility to meet a patient's scheduling needs. Whereas, if you don't, then you've now lost a referral because you're limited to one day. People do that a lot. They'll negotiate with a site, to have Thursdays off or whatever. I always say, try to negotiate, 2 half days, or try to see if you have any more wiggle room. That will help you build a practice more attuned to what other people can do, and you're paying the same amount. Sometimes too, people will not pay for a practice, not pay for a space, when in reality, it's going to probably pay for itself fairly soon. If you're like, I only have 2 people, but if you are limited to certain days and times, you will quickly see that you're going to lose referrals, and that it might be more cost effective to just get your own space and share it with someone, or that type of thing, or rent a couple of days from people. So that's a real pragmatic thing that can be really helpful, because if people can't meet at certain times, then you've now lost all those referrals. So. Yeah, Bianca.
Early on, you had mentioned how important it is to take into consideration our experience, but also recognize that there's still room to learn and to grow and to be curious. Was it like an aha moment for you, or how can we be mindful of that when we're 30 years into our careers?
I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure I'm quite understanding your question. Can you maybe say that in a different way, or?
Yeah, I'm just wondering how we can, I'm wondering how can we recognize if we're looking at our experience in a way that is useful or maybe hindering us, where we're for example, if we're getting to a point where it's like, hey, I've recognized this pattern, this is probably what it is, but it might not be, because these 2 patients are different patients. So not sure if I'm just wondering how we we can be, I don't know, how can we go about kind of checking ourselves and our experience and staying grounded in the fact that there's still to stay curious, essentially.
I think probably the biggest thing I would say, Bianca, is that like some of what I said earlier, like after the graduate school, it might seem like forever, but it's really just a start. And I've had more learning, classroom work, training, supervision, consultation, my own therapy, my own analysis, my own years and years of consultation post graduation. And I think when you're doing that, that's the most we can expect of anybody. So I would say that those sources of information continually help me learn and grow and help me identify my patterns or my vulnerable spots. And it's no 100% guarantee, but it's the best we can do with us our limited human selves. And I guess what I would say is I might, rather than say knowing myself as the starting point, because that could be overwhelming, and like most of us, usually our greatest strength is our greatest weakness. So the thing we're best at will also be our downfall. That's just human nature. But I would say in terms of this focused area, identify what are some of the problems, what are some of the issues, what are some of the challenges you're having in private practice, for example, or in your clinical self. And then you need to really do a deep dive and a look at what you know of your patterns and yourself and your experience and see if there's a connection or not. So I guess that would be the simplest way to answer it. But that's certainly a question that we could spend, a whole semester class on. So anyway, okay, Benjamin.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to know, aside from your LinkedIn page and, referrals, what are some effective ways that you've found promoting yourself and marketing that's been effective in getting clients?
Yeah, that's a great question. And what I would say is it has not typically been through the typical marketing routes that you might think. And so, again, if you go in a generic marketing route, it's not always tailored to what you want. Although certainly you can work with people that are good at marketing to tailor it more. So I'm not dismissing those routes. But what I would say is that the more active you are as a professional, the more engaged you are in the field. Like I said, engaging with other professionals is a huge way to market yourself. Being well trained, attending classes, being active in the field, giving back to the field. I did a lot of community service work. I've done so much pro bono work. I'm an active member of my professional society, my world, my professional group. And that helps you get known very naturally and organically in a way that's different than a marketing campaign where, you have somebody sending, emails to people about your services. While that might generate something, I think the more you're doing the work and doing the kinds of work you want to attract, the more you build connections, taking leadership positions in boards, being active in your professional organization, developing that general foundation, but then having a niche, going to seminars and trainings and connecting with like-minded professionals around that, getting to know other people that aren't doing what you're doing so you can give work to them. Those are all the things that I think are extremely effective. Does that
Awesome. Thank you.
help? I remember a lot of my students did these kits and they were really costly and people would do these marketing blitzes and they weren't at all connected to who their self was and what they could offer. And there was a total waste of money because it wasn't connected to them and the kind of work they were doing. So anyway.